Ladies and gentlemen, today I wanted to discuss the potential guidepost to the peace negotiations that could happen between Ukraine and Russia, dating all the way back to just 1 month into the Russian-Ukraine war in Eastern Europe. This was March 29th, the Istanbul meetings and the Istanbul draft, which the Kremlin says Russia and the United States see that 2022 talk as a potential basis and as a guide for peace negotiations with Ukraine. And Putin has reportedly said that it's just like the first step, it's a baseline. He might want more. Obviously, both Russia and Ukraine are in different spots as opposed to where they were in 2022. And this is an ongoing saga, especially back in 2022. If you remember back in April of 2022, it'd be like a month and a half, 2 months after the war broke out with Russia entering the eastern parts of the Donbas region of Ukraine. You had Boris Johnson telling Zelensky in a meeting, keep fighting, we're going to sanction them. The original strategy of the West was to hit Russia with sanctions, and it became a waiting match. The idea would be that the Russian economy would tank to the point to where Putin didn't see the war as really worth the economic situation that they were put into, similar to the United States and Donald Trump and his use of tariffs. Tariffs in the long run are good for a country like the United States in terms of increased domestic production and self-sufficiency, but in the short term, they do cause economic turmoil and they do raise prices in certain sectors that the tariffs are administered to. And so that's what they had hoped. That's why Boris Johnson said, keep it going, even though Ukraine was on the verge of signing a peace deal. Although there are some issues with this Istanbul agreement, it basically would completely demilitarize Ukraine to the point to where if Russia were to reinvade Ukraine, they would not be able to stop them. I think the idea would be if the United States is able to do some type of economic relationship or economic deal, including extracting minerals within the Donbas region, which under this new agreement would be annexed by Russia to connect the Crimean Peninsula to the new territories that Russia would annex, that would be east of the new DMZ, the demilitarized zone that would be set up and would be guarded by potentially NATO troops. That's why when you're hearing the whole thing about the UK possibly sending troops to Ukraine or to Turkey, I think it's mainly for negotiations. We've also seen, and this is just the new European model with Donald Trump and everything that happened with Trump and Zelensky. And now, I think the next step in this war is the minerals deal. It has to be. The next step has to be the minerals deal between the United States and Ukraine. And I'm saying it has to be for Ukraine. Ukraine, going into a negotiating period, they need the United States on their side. This is why Europe now has said, and you've got Germany, you've got the UK, you've got France, all saying they're going through a rearmament period. They're going to up their defense spending because of the new administration within the United States, their opinion of Russia, which is exactly what Donald Trump wanted. It's exactly what Trump wanted. He wanted the European countries to up their military spending. Look at NATO back in 2017, 2018, when Trump said countries weren't even contributing 2% of their GDP to defense spending. And that was when those countries, it's not like they have high GDPs anyways, especially compared to the United States. That's how you get the United States paying for around 70% of NATO in terms of the defense spending. Take a look at this potential peace deal as it was discussed in 2022. Obviously, both Russia and Ukraine are in different spots. I would assume Putin thinks he has maybe a little bit more leverage in terms of just the longevity of this war. In 2022, you could certainly say there was more of an expectation that Russia would be more aggressive, deeper into like central Ukraine or even western Ukraine, as opposed to now to where it seems like they just want those eastern regions. The trade-off for Russia would be you're kind of beating Ukraine down to the point where they're running really low on manpower. So their leverage is hampered by their inability to have troops. And so the idea would be if you're Russia, we could really negotiate whatever we wanted as long as the United States stays out of this and NATO doesn't want escalation. And I wouldn't think the NATO countries, even in Europe at this point, would want escalation. Remember, Biden was extremely pro-NATO and they never sent in troops or did anything like that. It was always proxy sanctions or just giving military equipment. Apparently, there's been a lot of stuff where it's like, well, Trump said it was $300 billion. It's like the actual number's around 170 billion, and apparently only 120 billion has been accounted for in Ukraine. And they've been complaining, oh, it's old equipment, about the equipment the United States is giving them, but the United States by far has given them the most. That's not to say Europe can't up it if they really want to continue this war, which I don't think they do. It's mainly for Ukraine to go into the negotiating table saying that we have Europe on our side. And that's why they're going to do the minerals deal with the United States. They have to have the United States on their side when they're negotiating so they don't get crushed in negotiations because they have no leverage. You want all of NATO on your side for that. And so for them, that's why, according to Europe, Trump is this big bad guy for trying to end the war, because in trying to end it, you've got Europe and Ukraine saying, no, we're not doing this. We don't like giving up land or ceding certain things to Russia. Well, Trump's just trying to end it at this point. And the idea that, see, they live in la-la land. They're just like, well, what if they just reinvade? Well, what do you want to do? What do you suggest we do? Trump is trying to have a nice economic relationship with Russia, which potentially will deter them from invading if they have a more cordial relationship with a Western power like us. There's no way. The only way to do it would be a NATO offensive into eastern Ukraine to get the land back, and Russia would say, okay, we're done. But that's a risk assessment. See, modern war is all about risk assessment when it comes to these huge adversaries with the nuclear bombs involved. It's important to understand that, because you just don't know what Russia's going to do if that were to happen. If you're going to use NATO troops, it's a huge problem. And that's why the European countries realize that they don't want that. It's all proxy. Even sending troops to wherever, it's all just proxy. They're not going to actually engage with the Russian troops unless they really wanted to escalate it. And again, the idea would be if you can contain it to that region, you could, with the NATO troops, push Russia out of eastern Ukraine. And they would say, well, we can't fight NATO. We would lose, so let's not do this. Let's just go back. The problem is you risk escalation in terms of longer range missiles and then the potential nuclear bombs, which is what Trump was not brought in and elected to do. It's just not. So you can see Istanbul deal was discussed in early weeks of war. U.S. official has called it a possible guidepost towards a deal. Kremlin says Putin also sees it as a starting point. So a starting point with potential negotiations. Russia's going to say they have more leverage at this point in 2025 as opposed to 2022. In terms of them taking over all of Ukraine, I think they've got a lot less leverage than they did in 2022, because there was a big scare about them taking Kyiv and other major cities in the central of Ukraine. That's not a huge concern. Now it's more so Ukraine running out of troops, not so much of a huge Russian offensive into the center of Ukraine. You can see draft would have meant neutral status for Ukraine. So it's the idea, and Ukraine originally had proposed something like this during this meeting, to where they would not join NATO for, I don't know if it's 15 or 20 years, but they're basically just neutral. And that would also mean that they would want the assurances and the security guarantees from major superpowers. And you can see Kyiv has previously said the Istanbul draft is unacceptable because they would have to de-arm as well. That's the big problem for them. And so this is all negotiations. But you can see some of these documents. I don't know what I wanted to go to. This is the Ukrainian fears. So they're obviously worried about Donald Trump trying to mend ties with Russia, bring a swift end to the 3-year war. It's raised fears within Ukraine and European allies, talking about Ukraine's interests being sacrificed, just trying to end the war as fast as possible. You got the Trump-Zelensky meeting they talked about at the White House that really got Europe worried. Zelensky flew directly from D.C. to London, and then all of the top European leaders come together with a photo op and a meeting in London like 24 hours after Trump has the blow up with Zelensky in the White House. That's how shook Europe was by the meeting Trump had with Zelensky on that Friday a little over a week ago. And then you can see one of the other points of disagreements in the 2022 negotiations was Russia's demand for deep cuts to the size of Ukraine's armed forces and the number of its tanks, missiles, and warplanes and other weapons. The US-based Institute for Study of War wrote in an analysis last month that the terms of the Istanbul Protocol draft would have left Ukraine helpless to defend itself against any future threat from Russia. So that's a problem there. But where was the what was the agreement? So this is the big stuff right now. The draft documents discussed in talks in Istanbul at the end of March 2020. The end of March, that's a month after the war broke out. The war's started February 20th. It was like a month later. NATO giving up Ukraine giving up NATO ambitions and accept a permanent neutral and nuclear-free status in return for security guarantees from the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So that was the idea, but what about the land? So I'm guessing there's 2 thoughts. It either gets annexed or it becomes independent and the regions hold referendums, but I think it's probably going to be annexed and there'll be a DMZ somewhere set up over there, and there would be troops within some of these countries, especially the NATO countries, securing the DMZ. That would be my guess, but I'm guessing there will be land that's annexed in the Donbass region, and if you look at that area, it's very rich in natural resources. So I'm sure Russia really wants that, but this is like, people say, well, it's just a Band-Aid. There's really no way to, unless you want more escalation, because it's like, you could either think of it, we could have peace now and potentially a decent relationship with Russia. So that's peace with Russia, Ukraine, security for Ukraine, the minerals deal with Ukraine, U.S. involvement in Ukraine, which some Republicans would view as bad, by the way. But you have peace with Ukraine and you have peace with Russia. And that happens within, whatever, the next 4 or 5 months. You do that, and then you risk potentially Russia reinvading Ukraine within the next, decade. Or you say, no, the reinvasion is going to happen. They're just going to want more and more land. And so you mount an offensive and you escalate the war with NATO. Or, I guess what they were trying to do right now, this is what at least Rubio and others have said, they're just trying to bleed Russia out, which I'm not sure that's really an acceptable. How does that work if you're talking about, if it's just Russia against Ukraine, there's no way Ukraine can win. Yes, if NATO decided to fight with Ukraine, then yes, they could beat Russia, but then that would escalate it to the point where now you're talking about more war and potentially bigger weapons, if you know what I'm saying. So this is like the better of the 2 options. There's no perfect answer. There's no perfect answer for this. There's really not. So Ukraine is going to have to give some things up. Russia's going to have to give some things up, and there'll be some type of meeting in the middle. But it likely will be security guarantees from the NATO countries. Russia, they're not going to trust Russia, right? Because but it's probably going to be the U.S., Russia. I don't know. They're running China into this, Britain, France, the NATO countries. What are the security guarantees, though? That's the thing. How tied is the United States to this region in terms of the guarantee? Whatever gets, the verbiage of it is going to be very important. How does the minerals deal interact with it? Does Trump scrap the minerals deal? Ukraine needs the minerals deal because they need the United States on their side. So this all has to be worked out. But either way, guys, that's just the current situation. So this could potentially, again, you're talking about 2022 versus 2025. 2025, there's going to be more things brought up. I think there's more security for Russia in terms of the areas they currently have that they're probably going to annex, but I think there's less of a risk of Russia taking over all of Ukraine, which was seen as a huge risk in 2022, which potentially would give Russia more of an advantage in negotiations in 2022 versus 2025 because Ukraine has deterred them. Now, Russia, if they really wanted to launch a full force operation, yes, they could take over major parts of Ukraine just because they've got such a bigger army and a bigger arsenal. But do they want to invest that much in a war like this? We'll have to see what ends up happening in terms of these negotiations. But either way, guys, that's going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Links to that's always in the description.